I'm Daniel, 26 male, and I came home from a business trip to find my mother had rented out my room and thrown my things in the garage. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the pile of my belongings, but the silence. Our house, usually buzzing with the low hum of my mother's television shows or my sister's endless phone conversations, was eerily quiet when my rideshare pulled up just after 10 p.m. A wave of exhaustion hit me the moment I stepped out of the car. It had been a grueling 4-day trip to Chicago, filled with back-to-back meetings that had left my mind feeling like a wrung-out sponge. All I wanted was a hot shower and my own bed. I punched in the code for the front door, the familiar beeps a small comfort. Dragging my roller bag behind me, I stepped into the foyer and immediately stopped. Propped against the wall near the staircase was a piece of luggage I'd never seen before. It was a large, hardshell suitcase, slate gray and covered in stickers from places like Berlin, Amsterdam, and Prague. For a moment, my jet-lagged brain struggled to compute. Did my sister Chloe have a friend staying over? No, she would have mentioned it. Her entire life was an open book she insisted on reading aloud to everyone within earshot. A knot of confusion tightened in my stomach. I left my own bag by the door and walked into the living room. It was empty. The kitchen was dark. "Mom, Dad," I called out, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the stillness. A light flicked on at the top of the stairs and my mother, Karen, appeared. She was already in her floral nightgown, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. "Daniel, you're home," she said, her tone flat, as if I'd just returned from a quick trip to the grocery store. "Yeah, the flight landed a little early," I said, pointing a thumb back towards the foyer. "Whose suitcase is that?" She began her descent down the stairs, not meeting my eyes. "Oh, that's Hans," she said breezily. "He's lovely, from Germany, he's an architect." Hans, the name meant nothing to me, a friend of Chloe's. My mother reached the bottom step and finally looked at me. There was no warmth in her gaze, just a sort of weary impatience. "No, Daniel, he's our guest, the tourist." The word tourist hung in the air between us, sparking a sense of dread that began to chase away my fatigue. "Tourist? What are you talking about? Where is he staying?" She waved a dismissive hand. "Don't be so dramatic, we just rented out your room for a couple of weeks. We needed the money." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, for her to laugh and say she was joking, but her expression remained placid, almost bored. You rented out my room." "Yes," she said, as if explaining something to a child. "For Chloe's dress. The one she wanted was far more expensive than we budgeted for, and you know how she had her heart set on it. This was an easy way to make up the difference." I couldn't speak, my mind was a whirlwind of noise and confusion. My room, my bed, my desk, my entire private space. I thought of my laptop, my work files, my personal documents. Where is my stuff?" I finally managed to ask, my voice a strained whisper. My mother sighed, a put-upon sound she always made when she felt I was being difficult. "It's in the garage, Daniel, it's perfectly safe. We packed it all in boxes." Without another word, I turned and walked through the kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the tile. I pushed open the door to the garage and fumbled for the light switch. The fluorescent bulb flickered to life with a loud buzz, casting a sterile white glow over the scene. And there it was. My life stacked against a wall in a haphazard collection of cardboard boxes and plastic storage bins. My desk chair was perched precariously on top of a box labeled books, and my monitor was wedged between my dresser and a stack of old paint cans. It wasn't packed carefully, it was dumped. I stood there for a long time, just staring. The anger I should have felt was absent, replaced by a hollow, cold ache that spread through my chest. This wasn't a shock. Deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was just the latest and most blatant chapter in a story that had been writing itself for my entire life. This was the story of favoritism, a quiet but persistent poison that had seeped into the foundations of our family. Chloe, my younger sister by 4 years, was the sun around which my parents' world revolved. I was a distant, functional moon, useful for my gravitational pull on the family's finances, but otherwise left in the shadows. The examples were legion, a long, sorry parade of memories I usually kept locked away. I remembered when I was 17, working a whole summer at a sweltering car wash to save up for my first car. I had just over $2,000, a small fortune I kept in a lockbox under my bed. I had my eye on a reliable, if unglamorous, 10-year-old Honda. A week before Chloe's 18th birthday, my parents sat me down. They looked so earnest, so regretful. They needed to borrow my savings, they said. Chloe, being a young woman, needed something safer, more reliable. My little Honda could wait. They were going to use my money as a down payment on a brand new compact car for her. "We'll pay you back, son, we promise," my father Mark had said, his eyes pleading with me to understand. I did understand. I understood that I would never see that money again. I handed it over and Chloe got her new car, complete with a giant red bow. My parents never mentioned the loan again. Then came college. Our family didn't have much, but my parents had managed to put aside a modest college fund. It was meant for both of us. But when it came time for Chloe to apply, she fell in love with a small, private arts university with a tuition that made my eyes water. "She's so creative, Daniel," my mother had explained. "We can't stifle that." They drained nearly the entire fund for her first 2 years, leaving almost nothing for me, their justification. "You're so practical and smart, Daniel, you can get scholarships. A state school will be just fine for you." They were right. I did get scholarships, and I worked 2 part-time jobs bussing tables and stocking shelves to cover the rest, graduating with a degree in finance and zero debt, a fact my parents often pointed to with pride, as if it were their accomplishment and not a product of my own relentless effort. The final and most significant example was the very roof over our heads. 3 years ago, I came home from my first real job as a financial analyst to find my parents in a state of quiet panic at the kitchen table. A foreclosure notice was laid out between them. Decades of my mother's frivolous spending and my father's passive enabling, all in the service of keeping Chloe draped in the latest fashions and participating in every expensive extracurricular, had finally caught up to them. They were about to lose everything. I spent a week running numbers, talking to banks, and liquidating the small portfolio I had painstakingly built since I was a teenager. I couldn't get a traditional loan to just give them the money, but my stable new job and spotless credit history allowed for another option. I bought the house from them. I paid off their mortgage and all their debts, and the deed was transferred legally and officially into my name. The agreement we made was verbal, sealed with my mother's tearful hugs and my father's solemn handshake. They could continue to live in the house rent-free. All I asked in return was that they pay the utilities and respect the simple fact that it was now my property. I would take my old room and we would function as a family. I did it to save them, to provide them with security. I never imagined they would one day see my ownership not as a safety net I had provided, but as a resource they could exploit. Standing there in the cold garage, looking at the careless pile of my existence, I felt the last thread of naive hope finally snap. They hadn't just rented out my room, they had rented out a room in my house and discarded me in the process. The casualness of it was what hurt the most. It wasn't a desperate, difficult decision for them. It was easy. Daniel could be put in the garage. Daniel would understand. But Daniel was done understanding. The exhaustion from my trip had vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. For years, I had quietly absorbed the imbalance. I had justified it, worked around it, and subsidized it. But this time was different. This wasn't just unfair, it was a fundamental violation of the trust and the very specific agreement that kept this family afloat. I turned off the garage light, plunging my boxed-up life back into darkness. I walked back through the kitchen, my face an unreadable mask. My mother was now in the living room, watching TV as if nothing had happened. "I'm going to get a hotel for the night," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. She didn't even look up from the screen. "Oh, all right, don't spend too much." I didn't reply. I grabbed my roller bag from the foyer, walked out the front door, and didn't look back. As I sat in the back of another rideshare, watching the familiar silhouette of my own house recede into the night, I wasn't just leaving for a hotel. I was leaving a version of myself behind, the compliant, understanding son who always picked up the pieces. He was gone for good, and in his place, a man with a plan was beginning to form. A man who happened to have a very important folder in the glove compartment of his car, which was parked, thankfully, on the street and not in the garage. The hotel room was sterile and impersonal, a beige box of bland furniture and generic art, but it felt more like a sanctuary than my own home. I dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and sat on the edge of the king-size bed, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the storm raging inside my head. The initial shock had subsided, leaving behind the cold, heavy sediment of betrayal. It wasn't just the room. The room was a symbol. It was the physical manifestation of my place in the family hierarchy, temporary, disposable, and easily sacrificed for Chloe's latest want. My mother's casual tone echoed in my ears: we needed the money. It was the same logic they had used for the car, for the college fund, for a dozen smaller slights over the years. My needs were negotiable, Chloe's were absolute. For a long time, I just sat there, tracing the patterns on the hotel comforter with my finger. Part of me, a small, wounded part, wanted to call my mother and scream. I wanted to demand she throw the tourist out and put my room back together. I wanted to hear an apology, a real one, full of the remorse she so clearly lacked. But I knew it would be a pointless exercise. She would twist my anger into an accusation of selfishness. "How can you be so worried about a room when your sister's happiness is at stake?" she would say. My father would stand by silently, his discomfort his only contribution to the conversation. No, an emotional outburst was what they expected. It was a currency they knew how to devalue. What they wouldn't expect was a calm, calculated, and irreversible response. After a long, hot shower that washed away the grime of the flight but not the filth of the situation, I felt a new sense of purpose crystallize within me. I put on a fresh shirt, walked out of the hotel, and drove my car to a 24-hour printing shop. The folder I needed was in my glove compartment. I had put it together over a year ago, not out of malice, but as a grim sort of insurance policy. I called it my doomsday folder. Inside was a pristine, notarized copy of the house deed, clearly stating my name, Daniel Markinson, as the sole proprietor. Behind it was a copy of the final mortgage satisfaction letter, proving the property was owned free and clear. And behind that was a copy of the original sales agreement, the one my parents had signed, transferring ownership to me for the price of their outstanding debt. I even had a printout of the bank transfer, showing the exact amount leaving my account and going directly to their mortgage lender. It was an airtight case, a silent, factual rebuttal to the unwritten family constitution that had governed our lives. At the print shop, I made fresh copies of everything. I also typed up 2 new documents. The first was a formal month-to-month lease agreement for the house with the rent set at the current fair market value for a property of its size in our neighborhood, an amount I knew they couldn't possibly afford. The second was a formal 60-day notice to vacate the premises. I printed them both on high-quality paper. Holding the crisp documents in my hand, I didn't feel vengeful. I felt anchored. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restructuring a broken foundation. The next morning, I called the one person I knew would understand, my old mentor, a retired professor named Arthur who had taken me under his wing in college. He was a shrewd, kind man who had taught my business ethics class, and we'd stayed in touch. I met him for coffee at a small cafe, the folder sitting on the chair between us. I laid out the story, starting with the suitcase in the foyer and ending with the pile of my belongings in the garage. I told him about the car, the college fund, and the truth about who owned the house. Throughout my entire recounting, Arthur just listened, his steepled fingers resting against his lips, his gaze steady and thoughtful. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute, stirring his coffee slowly. "Daniel," he finally said, his voice calm and even, "in my class, we often discuss the difference between legal obligations and ethical duties. Your parents have, it seems, failed spectacularly on both counts." "I feel guilty, Arthur," I confessed, the words tasting like ash. "They're my parents. I'm about to hand them an eviction notice." "Are you?" he asked, raising a bushy eyebrow. "Or are you handing them a choice, a consequence? They made a decision based on the assumption that your generosity was infinite and your boundaries were non-existent. They treated you not as their son, but as a household utility. You're not cutting off their power, Daniel. You're just sending them the bill." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "This isn't just about a room. This is about your future. If you let this go, you are setting a precedent for the rest of your life. Every promotion you get, every bonus you earn will be seen as a resource for them to tap for Chloe's next need. They violated the sanctuary of your home, a home that is legally yours. The trust required for that original agreement to function is gone. You are not just justified in your actions. You are, in my opinion, required to act to protect yourself." His words cut through the fog of my guilt, leaving only clarity behind. He was right. This wasn't an attack, it was a defense. I had spent my entire life accommodating their narrative. It was time to force them to read mine. I thanked Arthur, his validation a shield against the emotional storm I knew was coming. I spent the rest of the day in a state of strange calm. I checked out of the hotel and drove to the house, parking down the street. I didn't go in. I just sat in my car, watching. I saw my father leave to run an errand. I saw Chloe's car pull up and saw her bounce out, likely for another pre-wedding planning session with our mother. I wasn't angry anymore. The emotion had been burned away, leaving a core of pure, unshakable resolve. I was no longer the boy who had sadly given up his car fund. I was no longer the teenager working late nights to pay for a college education his parents gave away. I was a man who owned a house, and it was time for the tenants to learn the terms of their lease. I clutched the folder in my hands. The paper was cool and smooth. It was a simple collection of documents, but it represented the truth, and I was ready, finally, to make them read it. The next morning, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I needed to go back to the house, not just to initiate the confrontation, but to retrieve my work laptop and some essential files from the garage. The thought of my professional life being relegated to a dusty box filled me with a fresh wave of irritation. I let myself in the front door, this time with a key I had, pointedly avoiding the keypad. The house was quiet. In the living room, a man I presumed to be Hans was sitting on the sofa, sipping coffee and scrolling through a tablet. He looked up as I entered, a friendly, open expression on his face. He was in his late 30s with sandy blonde hair and clear blue eyes. "Good morning," he said in a lightly accented English. "You must be Daniel. Your mother told me about you." "Did she?" I replied, keeping my tone neutral. It was a struggle. I wanted to ask him what exactly my mother had said. Did she tell him I was the owner of the house he was staying in, or just the disgruntled son whose room he'd usurped? "Yes, she mentioned you were on a business trip. A beautiful home you have here," he said, gesturing around the room. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. "Thank you," I managed to say. "I just need to grab a few things from the garage." "Of course," he said with a smile, turning his attention back to his tablet. He was just a guy on vacation, completely oblivious to the domestic bomb he was sitting on. His presence made the entire situation feel even more surreal, like a scene from a strange play where only I knew the script. I walked to the garage, the door groaning in protest as I opened it. The sight of my belongings, still in their chaotic pile, sent another jolt of cold anger through me. I located the box with my electronics and carefully pulled out my work laptop, my personal computer, and a hard drive of backups. As I was checking them for damage, I heard the back door swing open. It was Chloe. She was dressed in trendy athleisure wear, her hair in a perfect ponytail, a vibrant green smoothie in her hand. She beamed when she saw me. "Danny, you're back. Mom said you were staying in a hotel. A little dramatic, don't you think?" she said with a light, teasing laugh. I didn't answer, just continued to wipe the dust off my laptop case with the sleeve of my jacket. "Oh, don't be like that," she chided, leaning against the doorframe. "It's only for 2 weeks, and it's for a good cause. Wait until you hear about the dress. Mom and I went for the final fitting yesterday. It is literally a dream. The lace detailing is incredible. Mom was able to put down the rest of the deposit thanks to our little German friend." She took a loud sip of her smoothie, oblivious to the thunderous silence emanating from my corner of the garage. I finally looked up at her, my expression flat. "How much did this dream dress cost, Chloe?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. She blinked, momentarily taken aback by my tone. "Well, it was a bit of a splurge," she admitted, suddenly looking a little defensive. "It was $5,000, but Mom said we could make it work, and we did." $5,000 for a dress. A dress you would wear for 8 hours. They had displaced my entire existence, violated my home and my trust for a $5,000 dress. I thought of the $2,000 of car wash money they had taken from me, a sum that had felt like $1 million to my 17-year-old self. The disparity was staggering. "Right," I said, a single sharp syllable. I turned my attention back to my things, my movements precise and economical. My coldness finally seemed to penetrate her bubble of excitement. Her smile faded, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "What's wrong with you? I thought you'd be happy for me. It's my wedding." "I'm thrilled," I said, my voice dripping with an irony that was lost on her. "No, you're not. You're being weird and moody," she pouted. "Is this because of your room? Honestly, Danny, it's not a big deal. You're barely even here half the time with all your work trips. We didn't think you'd mind." "You didn't think," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. That seems to be a recurring theme in this family. Chloe's face flushed with anger. "What is that supposed to mean? Mom and Dad are doing their best to give me the wedding I've always wanted. You should be supporting them, not sulking in the garage because you have to be slightly inconvenienced." That was it. The word inconvenienced was the match on the gasoline. It wasn't an inconvenience. It was a profound act of disrespect that summarized 26 years of being treated as an afterthought. I stood up, holding my laptop case in my hand like a shield. I looked her straight in the eye, and for the first time, I didn't try to hide my contempt. "This conversation is over, Chloe," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm waiting for Mom and Dad." I pushed past her, not roughly, but with a finality that made her take a step back. I walked into the kitchen and placed my laptop on the counter, then stood there, waiting. Chloe followed me, her face a mixture of confusion and indignation. "Waiting for what? What are you going to do?" she demanded. I didn't answer. I just stood in the heart of the house, a silent, ticking clock. The tourist was in the living room, my sister was fuming behind me, the stage was set. All I needed was the rest of the cast to arrive, and when they did, the play would finally begin. It was another 20 minutes before my parents returned. I heard their car pull into the driveway, the sound of my father's tired engine a familiar prelude to their arrival. They came in through the garage, their arms full of grocery bags. My mother entered the kitchen first, her expression bright until she saw me standing there, silent and immovable. "Daniel, you're still here," she said, her voice laced with a slight annoyance, as if my presence was an untidy mess she had to clean up. "We need to talk," I said. My father, Mark, walked in behind her. He saw my face, then glanced at Chloe's resentful pout, and his shoulders slumped. He was a man who hated confrontation above all else, and he could clearly sense a monumental one brewing. "What's all this?" he asked, setting his bags down heavily on the floor. "Everything okay?" "No, Dad, nothing is okay," I replied. I walked into the living room where Hans the tourist was still engrossed in his tablet. I stopped. "Excuse me, Hans," I said, my voice polite but firm. "I'm sorry to interrupt your morning, but I need to have a private conversation with my family. Would you mind giving us the room for a little while?" Hans looked up startled. He glanced from my stony face to my mother's tightening expression and quickly got the message. "Oh, yes, of course, no problem," he said, gathering his things. "I think I will go for a walk, explore the neighborhood." He scurried out the front door, closing it softly behind him. My mother shot me a furious look. "What do you think you're doing, embarrassing our guest?" "He's your guest, Mom, in my room," I said, my composure unwavering. "Please sit down, all of you." I gestured to the sofa. Hesitantly, my parents sat on one couch and Chloe flounced onto an armchair, crossing her arms defensively. I remained standing. I retrieved the large manila folder from my briefcase, which I had placed on the entryway table. I walked over to the coffee table and placed the folder squarely in the center. The soft thud it made seemed to thunder in the silent room. My mother eyed it with suspicion. "What is this, more of your dramatics?" I looked her directly in the eye, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. My next words were the ones I had been rehearsing in my mind for 2 days. "You said you needed money for Chloe's dress. Then read this." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by her usual defiance. With a scoff, she reached forward, picked up the folder, and opened it. I could see her expecting to find bank statements or a budget I'd drawn up to lecture them with. Instead, her eyes fell upon the first page, the official property deed. I watched her scan the document, her brow furrowed in confusion. I saw the exact moment she found the name listed under grantee. Her eyes widened. Her mouth fell slightly open. She blinked several times as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She held it out to my father. Mark took the paper from her trembling hand. His eyes, faster to grasp the implications of legal documents, scanned the page and immediately found the truth. All the color drained from his face. He looked up at me, his expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. "Daniel," he stammered, this says you own the house." Chloe shot up from her chair. "What? That's ridiculous. We own this house, don't we?" she asked, looking back and forth between her pale parents. My mother was frantically flipping through the other documents in the folder. She saw the mortgage satisfaction letter from their bank, dated 3 years ago. She saw the sales agreement, bearing her own familiar signature and my father's, legally transferring the property. She saw the bank statement showing a massive withdrawal from my account. Each page was another nail in the coffin of her reality. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the full weight of the information to settle upon them. Finally, I spoke. "For the last 3 years," I began, my voice calm and methodical, leaving no room for argument or interpretation. "You have not been living in your house, you have been living in my house. When you were about to be foreclosed on, I used every cent I had and took out a massive loan in my own name to buy this property from you to save you from losing it. The agreement, as I recall, was a simple one. You could live here rent-free so you could get back on your feet. In return, all I asked was for my space and my property to be respected. I asked you to treat this house as if it were still yours, but to remember that legally it is mine." I paused, letting my gaze drift from my mother's ashen face to my father's horrified one, and finally to Chloe's utter disbelief. "You didn't just rent out a room," I continued, my voice hardening slightly. "You rented out a room in a house you don't own. You took my belongings, my personal and professional life, and you threw them in a garage. You did this without a phone call, without a question, without a shred of respect for me or for our agreement. You broke that agreement. The trust is gone." The room was deathly quiet. The only sound was the rustle of the papers as they slipped from my mother's numb fingers onto the couch. The truth, in all its stark, undeniable black and white clarity, was finally out, and their world had just been turned upside down. The silence that followed my declaration was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and arrogance out of the room. My father stared at the deed in his hand as if it were a venomous snake. Chloe's mouth opened and closed silently like a fish out of water. But it was my mother who broke first, and not with the remorse I might have once hoped for, but with a surge of pure, undiluted indignation. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "How could you do this behind our backs? You let us believe, you let us think." "Let you think what, Mom?" I countered, my calm a stark contrast to her rising hysteria. "That my saving you from financial ruin came with no strings attached. The string was simple, respect. A string you cut the moment you put my life in boxes for the sake of a dress." "We're your parents," she cried, falling back on her oldest and most powerful weapon. "This is our family home. You can't hold some paperwork over our heads and act like you're our landlord." "But that's what I am," I said, the words falling like ice chips into the heated atmosphere. "Legally, that is exactly what I am, and you are my tenants, tenants who have violated the terms of their residency." My father finally found his voice, a pleading, panicked whisper. "Son, listen, your mother, she didn't think it through. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. We're sorry. We can have Hans leave today. We'll put your room back. We can just forget this ever happened." "No," I said, the word sharp and final. "We can't, because this isn't about the room anymore. This is about the fact that you thought you had the right to do it. This is about years of me being the safety net, the backup plan, the person whose contributions are taken for granted while Chloe's every whim is treated as a necessity. The pattern stops today." Chloe, finally processing the implications beyond the immediate shock, took a step forward. Her eyes were wide with a dawning horror that was entirely self-centered. "Daniel, what does this mean? For the wedding, for us?" she asked, her voice small. "You can't. You wouldn't kick us out, would you? You'd ruin everything." Her words, meant to guilt me, only strengthened my resolve. She still didn't see me, the brother who had been wronged. She only saw the potential disruption to her perfect day. "What happens next is up to you," I announced. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out the 2 documents I had prepared at the print shop. I laid them on the coffee table on top of the deed. "You have 2 options," I stated, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Option A is a formal, month-to-month lease agreement. It outlines that you will be responsible for paying the full fair market rent for this property, due on the 1st of every month starting next month. The amount is on the first page. It's non-negotiable." I saw my father flinch as he scanned the number. It was an amount I knew they couldn't sustain without making drastic, fundamental changes to their lifestyle. "Option B," I continued, tapping the second document, "is a 60-day notice to vacate the premises. If you choose this, you will have 2 months to find another place to live, at which point I will be changing the locks and putting this house on the market." I looked at each of them in turn, my gaze hard and unflinching. "This is not a discussion. This is a decision you have to make. I am no longer funding this family. My money will no longer be used to buy cars I don't drive, to pay for tuition I didn't receive, or to purchase $5,000 wedding dresses. The free ride is over. You have 24 hours to tell me which of these documents you will be signing." My mother stared at the papers as if I had just placed a bomb on the table. The rage in her eyes was now mixed with pure, uncomprehending panic. "You're a monster," she whispered, "to do this to your own family." "No, Mom," I said, a profound sadness welling up inside me, but my voice remained steady. "I'm just a financial analyst balancing the books, and this family's account has been in the red for a very long time. It's time to pay the debt." I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on their stunned silence, and walked towards the door. "I'll be back tomorrow at noon for your decision," I said without looking back. "I suggest you use the time wisely." I closed the front door behind me, the soft click sealing the end of one chapter of my life and the terrifying, liberating beginning of the next. The 24 hours that followed my ultimatum were, I imagine, the longest and most tumultuous my parents had experienced in years. I didn't stay to witness it. I went back to my car, drove to a quiet park, and sat on a bench, letting the cool afternoon air clear my head. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. First, it was my mother, then my father, then Chloe. I ignored them all, silencing the device and putting it in my pocket. There was nothing to say. The terms were on the table, the ball was in their court. Later that evening, the texts began. My mother's were a torrent of fury and wounded pride. "You ungrateful child. After everything we've done for you, you'll regret this." My father's were pleading and desperate. "Daniel, please call me. We can work this out. Don't do this to your mother. This is tearing our family apart." But it was Chloe's message that truly revealed the chasm between us. It wasn't angry or pleading, it was manipulative. It was a long, rambling text about our childhood, about how I used to push her on the swings, about how she always looked up to me. It ended with, "Is throwing all that away really worth it just to punish us? You're going to ruin the happiest day of my life over a stupid room." I read her text and felt a deep, weary sadness. She still thought this was about her wedding. She couldn't comprehend that her wedding wasn't the cause, it was just a symptom of the disease, the same disease that had eaten away at my car fund and my college education. The disease of my invisibility. I typed back a single, simple response. "This was never about your wedding, Chloe, it's about my entire life." She didn't reply. The next day, I arrived at the house at precisely 12:00 p.m. As I walked up the driveway, I saw that Hans's slate gray suitcase was gone from the foyer. A small, hollow victory. I let myself in. They were all there, sitting in the living room just as I had left them. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of defeat and resentment. The folder and the two documents I had left were still on the coffee table. My father looked like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were red-rimmed and his face was pale. My mother sat ramrod straight, her jaw set, staring at a fixed point on the wall. Chloe was slumped in her chair, her face puffy from crying. I stood before them, my hands in my pockets, and waited. "Well," I asked. My father was the one to speak, his voice raspy. "Daniel, we can't afford this rent," he said, gesturing to the lease agreement. "There's no way, we'd have to sell the car, cancel everything, it's impossible." "That sounds like a budgeting issue," I replied coolly. "Can't you just lower it?" he begged. "Meet us halfway for the sake of the family." "The time for family discounts ended when my belongings were piled in the garage," I said. "Those are the terms, the market rate, or you find a new market to live in. The choice hasn't changed." My mother finally snapped her head towards me, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "So that's it, you're just going to throw your parents out on the street?" "I am giving you an option to stay in a house that I own," I corrected her gently. "An option you wouldn't have if the bank had taken this place 3 years ago. You seem to keep forgetting that part." A tense silence fell over the room again. I could see the internal war raging in my father's eyes, the conflict between his loyalty to my mother's pride and the stark, unavoidable reality I had presented. Finally, with a deep, shuddering sigh of defeat, he leaned forward. He picked up the lease agreement and a pen that was lying on the table. "Mark, don't you dare," my mother warned, her voice low and dangerous. "What other choice do we have, Karen?" he shot back, a rare flash of spirit in his voice. "Where do you want to go? We have nothing, we have no savings, thanks to everything." He stopped short of blaming her or Chloe's expenses directly, but the implication hung in the air. "We have no choice." His hand trembled as he signed his name on the signature line. Then he pushed the document and the pen across the table towards my mother. She stared at it as if he had asked her to sign her own death warrant. For a full minute she didn't move. Chloe was sobbing quietly now, her face buried in her hands. The dream of her perfect, lavish wedding was dissolving before her very eyes. With a final, withering glare directed at me, my mother snatched the pen, scribbled her name violently on the page, and threw it back on the table. "I hope you're happy," she spat. I didn't answer. I walked forward, picked up the signed lease and folded it neatly, placing it in my inner jacket pocket. I left their copy on the table. "The first month's rent is due on the 1st, I said, my voice purely transactional. "I'll be moving my things back into my room this afternoon. I trust it will be empty and clean." I turned and left them there, a fractured family sitting in the wreckage of their own making. There was no joy in my victory, no satisfaction. There was only the grim, quiet finality of a necessary amputation. I had cut off the infected part of my life to save the rest of it. The 2 months that followed were a masterclass in Arctic civility. I moved my belongings back into my room that very afternoon. It was, as I had demanded, empty and clean. Spotless, in fact. My mother had clearly scrubbed it with a vengeance, and the faint scent of bleach seemed to be a passive-aggressive reminder of her displeasure. The dynamic in the house shifted from a dysfunctional family unit to that of a wary landlord and his resentful tenants. Conversations were brief, transactional, and confined to necessities. "The internet bill is on the counter. The plumber is coming on Tuesday to fix the leak under the sink." There were no more shared meals, no more casual chats in the living room. They would fall silent or retreat to their rooms whenever I entered a common space. I was a ghost in my own home, a constant, walking reminder of their humiliation. On the 1st of the month, an envelope appeared under my door. Inside was a check for the full rental amount. It cleared. They were selling things I knew. My father's second car was gone from the driveway. My mother no longer came home with shopping bags from expensive department stores. They were living within a budget for the first time in their lives, and they hated me for it. Chloe's wedding was the true casualty of the New World Order. With the bank of mom and dad officially closed and my own funds strictly off-limits, the grand affair she had planned evaporated. The $5,000 dress was returned, exchanged for a simple, elegant one off the rack that cost a fraction of the price. The guest list was slashed, the fancy venue canceled in favor of a small ceremony at a local park, and the elaborate catering was replaced by a modest reception at her fiancé's parents' home. I attended, of course. To not go would have been a declaration of war they could all rally against. My presence, however, was clearly an unwelcome obligation. I was seated at a table in the back with distant cousins and my father's work colleagues. Throughout the ceremony and reception, Chloe's eyes would occasionally meet mine, and her look was one of pure, undiluted resentment. To her, I was not the brother who had provided her family with a home. I was the villain who had stolen her dream wedding. My parents offered me tight, forced smiles and spoke to me only when absolutely necessary. I gave them a generous gift, a check that I knew would go directly to paying their next month's rent, and left early. Driving home from the wedding, I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt quiet. I felt a sense of loss for the family I wished I had, the kind of family that celebrated each other's successes and supported each other through hardships without a silent, toxic ledger of favoritism and neglect. That family had never really existed. But alongside the loss, there was a new feeling, one that was slowly taking root: peace. For the first time, I felt the solid ground of self-respect beneath my feet. I was no longer propping up a system that was designed to devalue me. I had drawn a line not in the sand but in concrete, and my life was finally my own. My finances were my own. My future was my own. I'm making plans now. I've been in touch with a realtor. My parents have a year-long lease and I will honor it, but after that I'm selling the house. The money from the sale will be a fantastic down payment on a place of my own, somewhere smaller, somewhere that holds no ghosts of past grievances. I will give my parents a fair warning and even offer to help with a security deposit on a new apartment. What they do from there is up to them. Their financial future is their own responsibility now. My relationship with my family is shattered, perhaps irreparably. They may never forgive me for holding up a mirror and forcing them to look at their own reflections. But as I sit here now in my clean, quiet room, a room that is indisputably mine, I feel a sense of freedom that is worth more than any strained family dinner or hollow holiday gathering. I broke the cycle. So Reddit, was I wrong to do this? In securing my own future, I had to dismantle the comfortable reality they had built at my expense. What would you have done?